Thank you for this gathering, which so many of us artists long to have this conversation of newness, this idea that artists are always looking for the future. And Christians ought to be looking toward the future. Christians ought to be futurists. And through dance and through art, through music, through what we do as artists, we are invoking the new. And part of my language, part of my role is to provide a language so all of us, whether you're artists or not, can join in that dance. The title of my talk has to do with cultural estuary, and you might wonder, what in the world is that? It's a term that I've been using in my idea of culture care, or the book Culture Care. I speak about this need for us in a divided, polarized, divisive world to be forced into a rich, abundant ecosystem. And an estuary is defined as a water passage where the tide meets a river current. So it's where the salt water mixes with fresh water. I write this: much of the Hudson River, like all of the intricate waterways around New York City, is an estuary. In an estuary, salt water mixes with fresh, bringing together multiple ecological layers and habitats to form the world's most diverse and most abundant ecosystem. This abundance arises from an environment that is delicately balanced and often harsh. An environmental scientist recently told me that while an invigorated estuary contains many pockets of homogeneity, like beds of eelgrass or oysters, it is ultimately heterogeneous. For these pockets are all in contact and often in competition with each other. And each pocket is subject to the ebbs and flows of the estuarial system, including variations in salt concentrations and sediments from the interactions of rivers and tidal waters. Estuaries are the most abundant and the most needed part of the ecosystem, but it is the most delicate. That's why if you are trying to restore the ecosystem, the entire marine ecosystem, you have to start with the estuary. When the Hudson estuary was decimated by years and years of neglect, we lost the oyster beds and we lost millions of striped bass going back to Hudson every May. But they're now back, and I talk about this in my book. And one of the ways that we can test to see if a given culture is vibrant and is producing something meaningful to the world is to see if it is indeed an estuary. And so the early 20th century New York City, with all the immigrants coming in, rushing in from Europe, and creating a fantastic mixture of influences, everything from Harlem Renaissance to abstract expressionism, flourished in competition in New York City, much like the Hudson. 16th century Japan, where Portuguese and Italian missionaries came into Japan. And at the same time, there was this indigenous form of art that was beginning to take shape in Japan, what we now know as Japanese culture. It just previous to this is the period known as Sengoku Jidai, which means literally feudal war times. unrest everywhere. Feudal powers vying to consolidate Japan through bloody means. And while that was taking place, a tea master named Senno Rikyu created an art form which influenced every category of the arts. So what we know as Japanese art and aesthetic today goes back to him. He created an estuary. In this war-filled time, in this conflicted time, tension-filled time, when people were saying there's no future, we have to fight our way to dominate and to win. This artist stood in the way of that, and we owe him the entire legacy, I argue, of Japanese history. When I talk about culture care to policymakers, people in Washington, D.C. is very busy, so you perhaps get 5 minutes to tell them everything I just said, and the importance of how to create diversity in this divisive, polarized time when homogeneous thinking is no longer a way toward the future. In order to be a futurist, you have to think beyond your box. You have to create a dialogue and conversation that moves beyond the boundaries and these categories we created for ourselves. I bring with me a little bottle of this. Tabasco sauce was designed in 1868. So last year was the 150th anniversary of Tabasco sauce. And we all missed it. Why do I carry a little Tabasco sauce to policy meetings in Washington, D.C., where I talk to the young policymakers, conservative policymakers, and the arts policymakers who tends to be very liberal? Well, it's about color theory. When you take a class in color theory, any painting class, the teacher typically tells you two things not to do, which is to combine or put next to each other complementary or opposite colors. So they say don't put orange next to a bluish green or purple next to a yellow. Don't go look at Fuller logo now. Sorry. Because they will clash and they will create this incredible, they will compete against each other on the palette. It will be impossible to control, so avoid that. And furthermore, don't mix them because they become this muddy brown. What did the designer of Tabasco sauce do? Exactly that. And brilliantly, this design hasn't changed that much since 1868. Is to put opposite colors of one orange, dark red, reddish orange, which is a liquid, right? It's absolutely brilliant. And then design the green around it. So when it sits on the shelf of a supermarket, it stands out because of the opposite colors, fighting each other, and it draws your attention. And what does it communicate? Pick me. It communicates spiciness. As if that wasn't enough, they came up with another one recently, which is the opposite, but the same idea. These bottles lined up, says, pick me. I'm spicy. And I tell the policymakers, democracy needs to be spicy. Can we live with that? Well, if you have a good designer, if you have a good leader who understands the complexity of an estuary, of how a community may work, come together perhaps in a seminary of all places. If these people who I had been this enormous privilege to work with called the Fujimura Fellows, they come out in this so many ways, bringing their gifts and talents to ask this question, can we be reconciled? Can we be together as a church? Can we learn to follow Christ in a different perspectives and different personalities? Oftentimes, it's hard, but we do it because the designer artist, God, loves this. Dr. President Mark Labaton said in chapel, God is not colorblind. God is obsessed with color.